Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really jumping into a big one. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. It's monumental, definitely influential, maybe a bit grim, depending on how you look at it.
Definitely impactful. Our goal here is to unpack its core arguments, using the source material we've got. We want to understand Hobbes's take on human nature, why we form societies, and crucially, what role government plays.
Right, and we're starting where Hobbes himself starts, this idea of read thyself. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, it's fascinating. He basically says, look inside yourself first. Understand your own thoughts, your own passions, desire, fear, hope, all that stuff. Because, he argues, those core feelings, those passions, they're fundamentally the same in everyone. So if you understand yourself, you get a handle on what drives other people too. It's kind of the key to figuring out human behavior.
Okay, so it's like an early psychological starting point for political theory. Understand the basic human drivers, those fears and desires, and then you can understand why we build societies, or commonwealths, as he calls them.
Exactly. He even calls the Commonwealth an artificial man. He's very systematic about it. He wants to describe this artificial creation by looking at its components, the matter thereof, which is man.
The building blocks.
Right. Then how it's made the covenants, the agreements, then the sovereign's rights and power, and finally, what keeps it going or what makes it fall apart. It's almost like an engineering approach to politics.
And those human building blocks?
Yeah.
He makes this distinction between passion and reason, doesn't he?
He does. Reason, for Hobbes, isn't something we're just born with, like senses or memory. It's attained by industry. It takes effort using language properly, thinking methodically. Science, he says, is knowing the consequences of actions.
Okay, different from just recalling facts.
Oh, very different.
Yeah.
And passions, they're the default setting, often leading us astray. He lists things like hate, ambition, greed, calls them infirmities.
Infirmities,
Oh,
huh?
wow.
Strong word.
Yeah. They cause trouble, lead to folly, unless they're checked by something, maybe fear, maybe extraordinary use of reason or punishment. He even links being vainglorious to anger. Basically, unchecked passions are a huge problem for social order.
So if that's the starting point, humans driven by these potentially destructive passions, needing effort for reason, needing checks, what happens when you put these individuals together without any authority over them?
Well, that takes us straight into his most famous concept, the natural condition of mankind, the state of nature.
The thought experiment.
Right. And he starts by saying, look, nature hath made men so equal, not identical, obviously, but equal in their basic abilities, body and mind. Crucially, equal enough that even the weakest person could potentially kill the strongest.
Through cunning or maybe teaming up.
Exactly. And that fundamental equality and vulnerability, that's the linchpin.
Because
if anyone can harm anyone else and resources aren't infinite and people naturally want things, maybe even just reputation or glory, this equality breeds diffidence.
diffidence, like deep distrust.
Profound distrust. Yeah, you can't trust anyone because they can harm you to get what they want. So competition plus distrust means you're always on edge, always needing to defend yourself.
And that constant need for defense leads to
What he famously calls the war of every man against every man.
Okay, but does he mean literally everyone is constantly fighting?
Not necessarily nonstop physical battles. He's careful to clarify that. War, he says, consisteth not in battle only, but in a tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known.
Okay. Like bad weather. It's not always raining, but the inclination is there.
That's his analogy, yeah. It's the known disposition towards conflict, the lack of any assurance of peace. Anytime that isn't the state of readiness for war, that's peace.
So what's life actually like then in this state of potential war with no common power to keep them all in awe?
Well, the texts paint a pretty grim picture. Everyone has to rely solely on their own strength and art for safety. Security is basically zero. It implies constant fear and danger of violent death. Because there's no trust, no security, there's no incentive for industry, agriculture, arts, culture. None of the things that make life, commodious.
And what about concepts like justice, right and wrong? Do they even exist there?
Hobbes is blunt. In the condition of mere nature, private appetite is the measure of good and evil. Without common rules and an enforcer, there's no shared standard. Your own desires, your own fears, that's all you got to go on.
But wait, you mentioned earlier something about laws of nature. Things like justice, equity, precepts found by reason.
Yes, good point. Reason can figure out these laws of nature, rules that, if followed, would lead to peace, Things like being fair, showing gratitude, being modest.
So why don't they work in the state of nature?
Because, Hobbes argues, they run contrary to our natural passions, pride, revenge, wanting more. And crucially, these rational laws have no teeth without the terror of some power to cause them to be observed.
The enforcement problem again.
Exactly. Reason points the way, but passion pushes you off the path. And there's nothing in the state of nature strong enough to force you back onto it. As he puts it so starkly, covenants without the sword are but words. Meaningless.
Right. An agreement is useless if there's no penalty for breaking it when you feel like it. Okay, so if the state of nature is this insecure, fearful, miserable place, what actually pushes people to truly get out of it?
It's really two main things: the overwhelming fear of death and the simple desire for a more comfortable, commodious life, which you can only really have in peace.
So raw self-preservation and the hope for something better.
Pretty much. Hobbes notes that everyone fundamentally agrees peace is good. And if peace is good, then the ways to achieve peace, those laws of nature like justice, equity, mercy, must also be good. The sheer awfulness of the alternative is the driving force.
And the mechanism for escaping this state, that's the social contract, right? Or the covenant, as Hobbes calls it. How does that actually happen?
It happens when individuals mutually agree with each other. They agree to give up their natural right to do absolutely anything they want, their right to everything.
They give up some freedom.
Yes, and crucially, they agree to authorize the actions of a single common power, the sovereign. They promise not to resist this sovereign, especially when it's punishing other people.
So you basically agree, I won't interfere when the sovereign uses force against others.
That's a key part. The source says, every man giveth away the right of defending another, but not of defending himself. You also promise to help the sovereign punish others.
But you always keep the right to defend your own life.
That seems to be the one right you don't give away. And Hobbes insists that this whole agreement, this submission, whether it happens peacefully when people get together to form a state or happens because they're conquered, it's all driven by fear.
Fear of returning to the state of nature or fear of the conqueror?
Both. He explicitly says covenants made out of fear are valid. If they weren't, he argues, then nobody in any government would truly be obligated to obey because fear is always part of the foundation.
And for this covenant to actually hold, to mean anything.
You absolutely need that common power set over them with right and force sufficient to compel performance. Without that power, that sword agreements just fall apart because, as he says, the bonds of words are too weak on their own. Fear of punishment is essential.
Okay, so that brings us to the sovereign power itself. What kind of power does Hobbes think is necessary to fulfill this role?
He insists it must be absolute and undivided. Now, the sovereign could be one person, a monarch.
Or it could be a group.
Or an assembly, yet what we might call an aristocracy or democracy. But the form isn't the main point for him here. The nature of the power, whoever holds it, must be absolute. The sovereign is the absolute representative of everyone who agreed to the contract.
Why absolute, though? Why can't the power be limited or shared? That sounds, well, safer to us, maybe.
For Hobbes, any division or limitation is inherently dangerous. It weakens the power needed to prevent society sliding back into that state of war, the war of every man against every man.
Because different powers might clash.
Exactly. He lists these essential rights of sovereignty. If you take these away, he says, the Commonwealth is thereby dissolved. And the list is pretty extensive.
Like what?
Things like having the final say in legal disputes, supreme judicature, deciding on war and peace, determining what's necessary for the common defense, levying taxes and raising armies, appointing officials.
Okay, those sound like fairly standard government powers, maybe.
But then he adds things like appointing teachers and examining what doctrines are conformable or contrary to the defense, peace, and good of the people.
Wow, okay, so the sovereign gets to control ideas too, deciding what people should be taught or believe. Why is that essential?
Because, in Hobbes' view, conflicting beliefs, especially about morality, justice, or even God's commands that contradict the sovereign's laws, are a direct threat to obedience.
Because if people think some other authority or rule is higher than the sovereign's law,
their loyalty is divided. Their obedience becomes conditional, and that division, that reliance on private judgment over public law, is, for Hobbes, a slippery slope right back to the chaos of individuals deciding everything for themselves. Controlling doctrine is about ensuring one public standard.
That's a stark view. So this all-powerful sovereign, are they subject to the laws they make?
No. Hobbes is very clear. The sovereign is not subject to the civil laws.
How does he justify that?
His logic is sort of recursive. To be subject to the law means being subject to the Commonwealth, which means being subject to the sovereign representative, which means being subject to himself. And being subject to yourself, he argues, isn't subjection at all. It's freedom from the laws.
Okay.
Plus, if the sovereign were subject to the law, you'd need someone else to judge whether they followed it, and then someone to judge that judge, and so on. It leads to confusion and dissolves the final authority needed to end disputes. The sovereign's will is the law.
And people need to respect this authority, presumably.
Absolutely critical. Hobbes says it's actually the sovereign's duty to make sure people understand why these sovereign rights are essential. And things like speaking ill of the sovereign or questioning their power, he calls that a great fault.
Why?
Because it breeds contempt, it slackens obedience, and the whole system relies on that obedience, on respecting that single ultimate authority to maintain peace.
Right. Okay, so we have the awful state of nature, the fear-driven contract leading to an absolute sovereign. What's it like for the average person, the subject, living under this system? Where does their freedom lie?
Well, Hobbes has a very specific definition of liberty. He says it's simply the absence of external impediments, obstacles preventing motion.
So, in the state of nature, you have total theoretical liberty, the right to do anything but constant impediments, like other people trying to kill you. I mean, you can't actually do much safely.
Precisely. Now, under the sovereign in a commonwealth, your liberty is found in the areas where the law is silent, meaning anything the sovereign has not forbidden through civil law. That's your sphere of freedom. The sovereign's will, expressed as law, sets the boundaries. It replaces your private appetite as the public measure of good and evil.
So the law tells you what you can't do, and liberty is everything else.
That's the basic idea. Civil laws are the sovereign's commands, defining rights, like property, and regulating actions. You're free in all the areas the law doesn't touch upon.
And when interpreting these laws, if there's ambiguity,
Hobbes suggests focusing on the intention of the legislator, which he assumes is always equity or fairness. You don't just stick rigidly to the letter of the law if it leads to an unreasonable outcome. You try to understand the underlying principle, which he connects to the law of nature, equity.
okay. And the duty to obey. How absolute is that for the subject?
It's extremely broad. Subjects are bound to obey the sovereign in, well, pretty much everything, even things touching on religion, unless the command directly contradicts the fundamental law of nature, which for Hobbes includes obedience to God's eternal laws.
But what if the sovereign commands something that goes against a law he himself made earlier?
Ah, interesting point in the text. Hobbes says that in such a case, the new command essentially acts as an abrogation or repeal of the old law for that specific situation. The subject is totally excused for obeying the latest command.
Which really underlines the sovereign's absolute current authority.
It does. The sovereign's present will override past laws.
One last piece.
Yeah.
Punishment. If subjects break the law, where does the sovereign get the right to punish them? Did the subjects give him that right?
Hobbes says no, it's not a right given by the subjects. Rather, the sovereign simply retains the right everyone had in the state of nature, the right to use force, the right to everything. When the Commonwealth is formed, everyone else gives up most of that right, but the sovereign keeps it.
So punishment isn't a granted power, but a retained natural right.
Yes, used for a specific purpose. He defines punishment as an evil inflicted by public authority, specifically to the end that the will of men may thereby the better be disposed to obedience. It's a tool based on that retained natural right to keep order through fear.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. We've traced Hobbes's argument from this pretty dark view of human nature driven by passion, fundamentally equal in vulnerability, leading to a state of constant fear and potential war.
The state of nature, yeah, where life lacks security, industry, comfort.
Right. And the escape route is this social contract, this covenant, driven primarily by fear of death and the desire for peace. Individuals agree to give up rights and submit to.
An absolute, undivided sovereign power. A monarch or an assembly, doesn't matter which form, the power itself must be total.
And this sovereign is the necessary sword that enforces laws, keeps the peace, and defines justice and injustice within the society. Liberty for the subject exists only in the areas the sovereign hasn't regulated.
Exactly. And the whole structure, the whole point of the Leviathan state is to prevent falling back into that state of nature, which Hobbes sees as the ultimate evil, the greatest evil that can happen in this life.
It's undeniably a powerful argument, maybe unsettling for many, but its logical rigor, starting from human nature and building up, has made it incredibly influential in political philosophy.
It certainly forces you to think hard about the relationship between freedom, security, authority, what government is fundamentally for.
And here's something really interesting to chew on, drawing directly from what we discussed. Hobbes was deeply concerned about things like superstition, or doctrines that challenge the sovereign's authority. He thought these things could misdirect people's fear, make them loyal to something other than the state, or encourage them to trust their own private judgment over the public law.
Right, he literally says taking away superstitious fear of spirits would make people much more fitted for obedience. He worried about people being led into conflict by others' ambitions because they were in a kind of darkness of mind.
Yeah. And think about this. He also noted that laws that aren't written down or properly published can only be understood through an individual's own reason, making them sort of both civil and natural law at the same time. So given Hobbes's intense focus on managing fear, ensuring belief aligns with public order, and the absolute necessity of clear, enforced public law, what does that tell us about navigating political authority and individual judgment in our world today? A world flooded with information, competing narratives, and diverse beliefs. Kind of makes you think, doesn't it?